Wow, thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Aloha, everybody. Mel and I, who are both based in Honolulu, are super stoked that we finally reached this moment today, third day into this conference. Nick and Chris, wow, this conference has been such a blast. Getting myself out of bed at 4:45 every morning to hear from the keynote in that flip format has kind of changed the rhythm of my life a little bit. So we really appreciate this opportunity. My name is Josh Rapoon. I am the host and producer of the What School Could Be podcast. Um, Today's session happened because What School Could Be has been in contact with and developing a relationship with the with Chris and Nick's organization, the Human Restoration Project, for quite some time now. In fact, I actually had Chris on my show back a couple of years ago. And that was a fabulous conversation. Chris loved every part of that, really pushed my envelope in terms of progressive education and progressive thinking in education. And so when we started to help promote this conference, that's what School Could Be has been doing, is social media and website promotion of the conference. Chris and I started talking about the opportunity to do a session. And since this conference is the conference to restore humanity, it took me the idea to have several podcast guests surfaced, and it took me literally about 3 seconds to make a decision about who the three guests would be today. And so before I go to the guests, I'm going to have my partner here, Mel Ching, introduce herself. Go, Mel.
Hi, thanks, Josh. My name is Mel Ching. I'm currently the Director of Community and Engagement at What School Could Be. So my role is really about the caring and nurturing and feeding of our community, our online community. I was previously an administrator, a classroom teacher, and a technology facilitator before I had the ultimate privilege of working with Josh.
And working with Mel has been one of the great privileges of my life. Day in and day out, we've probably shared about 70,000 text messages together. That's how we work. So it's been super awesome. So we have three of our recent former podcast guests with us today. And again, the topic is about great stories of elevating humanity in a school, on a campus, in a classroom. We have Chris Sweat, who's actually in Northern California in Ukiah. We have Annie Ray, who's in Virginia. And we have Charlene Otley, who's also, well, Charlene, you're in DC. So I thought we would start just really quick, Chris, with you. Just have you briefly introduce yourself, and then I'll talk a little bit about the session.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Josh, and thank you to the panelists and for everybody being here. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody listened to the podcast, but I am a recovering principal, although I just got lured back into the field after 1 year. I went back to the classroom to re-experience what it was like to be in conventional education, which was a great eye-opener. I recommend anyone who's an administrator going back into the classroom for at least a year to reconnect. But when I was as a principal for 9 years, I transformed a small public school, not charter, that was originally deemed as a continuation school. And I turned it into a choice school that was effectively under the auspice of big picture learning, and which effectively is an internship-based program with the intention that the kids learn through their interests as opposed to strict curriculum deemed whatever is the state is telling us to teach. So instead of we use the Common Core to drive the instruction, but basically the school was driven and ran by the kids, and so that was a secondary school. And thank you again for having me here today.
Already elevating humanity by putting the kids in charge. That's awesome. Annie, we'll have you go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Ray, and I am the Orchestra Director and Performing Arts Department Chair at Annandale High School. I'm also the 2024 Grammy Music Educator Award winner, which is crazy and something I'm still I mean, Josh heard me this. I'm still processing, Josh. But I'm really honored because the school I teach at is amazing. We have over 66 different countries represented there. 59 different languages are spoken. 70% of our students speak a language, or I'm sorry, 80% of our students speak a language other than English at home. And 70% of our students fall below that poverty line. So it's such an incredible, diverse background, so many different perspectives that get brought together every day, and to see that all come together at my classroom has been one of the greatest honors of my life. So I'm so excited to be here with you all today, and to learn from such great educators. I loved listening to your podcasts.
Thank you, Annie. And I'll just share with you that I came home from work on a Sunday night and found my wife watching the Grammys. And she paused it and immediately started shouting at me, "You have to see this. You have to see this." And so Cheryl actually went out and contacted Fairfax County and arranged for Annie to be on the show. And that was a blast to do that prep and to do the interview together. Terrific. Charlene.
Hello, everyone. I am Charlene Otley. I live in Maryland, but work in the District of Columbia. I am the Director of Community Outreach and Research at the River School, which is an independent school in DC. It's an inclusion program for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. So I'm a speech language pathologist by training. So there's a speech language pathologist in every classroom in our program that supports the students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we focus on project-based and thematic-based learning. And my role at the River School has been to develop community-based programming for children who are underserved and those from marginalized backgrounds. So I've developed a number of programs that support families from those communities, particularly those who are deaf and hard of hearing. So I am in the throes of running one of my summer programs right now. We're down staff. So like Chris said, I am in it. I'm back in it and just not being the administrator, but I'm in it. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to work with such a great team that is really passionate about changing and transforming education. So that's who I am.
It's fabulous. Thank you, Charlene. So what we're going to do is for a little while, we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves, us five who all have the same background here. And Mel is going to take us through the first round of questions for our three podcast guests. And we'll do a little bit of follow-up and a little bit of conversation. And then would love to take your questions from the chat, or if you want to come off mute and ask your questions just like we've done in other sessions. So Mel, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Josh. I've been waiting for this. Annie, I wanted to start with you first. This is a question that's been really on my mind since I listened to your podcast episode back in March, right? So you had shared that there was a Facebook post by a parent expressing dismay that their child was bringing home a recorder to learn how to play. And really how disheartening that is for you in the program, but especially for the child. But yet out of that grew this idea to create a parent orchestra program. And I thought, what a lovely way to lean into this kind of negative situation with both compassion and empathy, and really turn it into this rich learning experience for you and your community. So would you tell us a little bit more about that process and how it came to fruition?
Oh my gosh, it's such a great question. I love that parent orchestra class. It's great, and it's not just for parents. I specifically in our description say caregivers of all kinds. We come, and so we do have like teachers who come and learn, and our superintendent even popped in for a little bit, which was fun. So it's great. We have over 200 caregivers who learn how to play their kids' instrument every year now. And the reason that like it came up, and it's this thing with music, people don't really know what we're trying to teach, right? They really think that we're trying to put on this fantastic performance on stage, and while we are, that's the end result. What we're actually trying to teach is so much greater than that. There's so much more that's happening between the notes and rhythms on the page, and it's something that you like can't really understand until you've gone through that process together. And so it's turned into this really beautiful thing where these parents are now, as adults, being really bad at something. And they get to model that for their students. And they understand now why, okay, well, my kid was in fourth grade strings for a year, why can they barely squeak out Twinkle Twinkle on their violin? Well, when you only see your teacher once a week, and that may be the only time that they're practicing, not a lot of progress can be made. And so these parents start to understand so much more about like how difficult it is what we're asking these students to do. And it's turned into this really, really incredible thing. As a music teacher, that's one of the most fundamental things that you have to learn is to teach people what you are actually teaching. So nothing is better than that, than this experiential learning.
Annie, can I ask a follow-up question? So since this is the conference to restore humanity, I remember we talked about how this literally you were uplifting two communities, the parent community and the students themselves, and that through that empathy that was created in the parent orchestra, there was a sort of reimagining of what humanity is in that moment. Is that kind of a fair way of looking at what happened?
Yeah, that is a great way to put it. And something that we didn't get to dive into as much, Josh, because I was still in the middle of like this post-Grammy like chaos, was the fact that like my entire program is based around something that we call the Suzuki triangle. And it's this concept of music education where it's this triangle, and each apex is like we have the student and we have the parent and then we have the teacher. And only great learning can come when all three sides are nurtured. And I'm what is in the chat, I would love to hear everyone's just like brief like background, like what is your title, because I'm sure a lot of you are what I like to call the connectors. So our school is incredible because we don't just focus on the parents or the community, so that being like parent orchestra for us, or for the school-wide thing, our food bank, our parent programs or stuff for, then we have our students, obviously our student learning, and then our teacher side of it too, of nurturing those teachers. And it's the connectors, those in between people, the people that actually make the physical triangle, that make this whole thing work, this whole humanity that you're talking about, this whole ecosystem. Yeah, and so I'm sure like Gareth, for example, like you always want as like a teacher, like an administrator, to care about you and your well-being too. And so that's the great thing about like our school as a whole, is like they've really adopted this philosophy as well. Not just in our music classroom, taking this music classroom idea and bringing it to the whole school. It makes just this vast difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Annie.
Perfect. I kind of wanted to follow and explore this idea of community in the schools just a little bit more with Dr. Otley. So in your episode, you had this conversation with the River School founder, Nancy Mellon, about children who needed additional help and were kind of falling through the cracks for whatever reason, not getting the services that they need, and perhaps not finding their way to the River School. So my understanding is you started a program called iLead. And I'm going to read the full name so I don't mess this up. The Intensive Literacy Enrichment Activities for Diverse Populations. Would you tell us a little bit more about the program itself, your thinking behind implementing some of those reading strategies? And what I was really interested in were those additional supports that you provided, such as free meals for the families and the parent training portion of that, as well as like this whole gift of free books that they had at the end of the program. So how did your focus on the family unit and community really inform your decisions on how to develop that program?
I think just coming from, my parents are immigrants, and coming from a family-centered kind of approach, I always think about the family unit as we're educating not only the students, but also the parents and the caregivers, and they're part of the educational journey. So that's why the program focused so heavily on the parent and caregiver training, because once we are able to connect with the families and they see that we connect with them, we care about them, that also transfers to their children and vice versa. So the iLead program was developed because it kind of starts from, again, I am in the space of deaf and hard of hearing. And if you think about if anyone has children, hopefully they got a newborn hearing screening when they were first born. And in the District of Columbia, the rate of children who are lost to follow-up after getting a newborn hearing screening is 80%. And most of those children are from marginalized backgrounds. So recognizing that there was a huge need and that there was a huge gap for children receiving services, what we were seeing was them popping back up again when it was time for them to go to school. So if these children are profoundly deaf and may benefit from, let's say, a cochlear implant, a lot of these children were getting cochlear implants. DC will pay for the cochlear implant, but they won't pay for therapy. They won't pay for any intervention. They expect the school to do that. But we as educators know that if you give a child, let's say they're one or beyond one, a cochlear implant, and you don't provide them any sort of intervention, you give them a hearing aid and you don't provide any intervention for 5 years when they end up in the school system, what type of spoken language skills might they have? And 80% of, or 90% of children who are born who are deaf and hard of hearing are born to parents who are hearing, and most of those parents want them to develop spoken language. So recognizing this huge gap, it's not something that I could accomplish on my own. That's when I had that conversation with Nancy, because we are seeing kids kind of coming through the system later and not knowing about the services that we provide. We're a very small, institution. And so I said, let's do something that's community-based so that we can reach out to the community and see if we can help rectify this issue in our own way. So I got some seed funding from my national organization, which is the American Speech Language Hearing Association, to start a pilot program. And then from that year, I was able to garner funding from different private donors to continue the program. And we're now in our 7th year. We're in our last week. We finish on Friday. But it is a 3-week program that focuses on literacy strategies, recognizing that vocabulary is the foundation for academic content. Once you have a strong vocabulary, you're able to transfer that knowledge into all of your academic domains. So we focus heavily on vocabulary and bolstering those skills and using interactive reading strategies with the students. And we use beautifully diverse books. I think the literature has gotten so much better. When we first started, it was very difficult to find a lot of books that were representative of the children. We're very intentional about selecting books where children can see themselves in everything. So we've partnered with First Book. I don't know if any of you all know about them, but they provide books to educators who are working with children from marginalized backgrounds. And so we're able to provide all the families when they leave the program with at least 10 to 12 brand new picture books that they can take home, and they're able to extend their learning. And then we also help train the parents how to use those literacy strategies in the home. Sometimes families may feel hesitant to look at a book and read it, especially if their literacy levels aren't where they want them to be. So we're showing them you can use the pictures in a book to facilitate language. You can use the pictures in the book to talk about the vocabulary. You don't have to read the words word for word to be able to connect with your child. So that's what we're trying to teach families, that there's multiple ways that you can connect through literature, and recognizing how important it is for kids to see themselves. I remember having a conversation with my colleague, and she asked me, what book did you see yourself in? Like, what can you remember as a child? And I couldn't remember. I couldn't answer the question because there weren't all of the books that had characters who looked like me were about a struggle. They weren't just about an everyday person who existed, who maybe his family came from another place, and this is what we did as a family, this is what we ate, this is where we went. Everything was about a struggle. So again, the intentionality with the types of books we're using, I think has really shown, it's really been beneficial in how the students have been able to respond to their intervention. And we've seen tremendous growth in their outcomes. So we're really proud of that.
Mhm. I love that that intentionality of family and community, and also creating that very safe space for parents who didn't feel comfortable prior to entering your program. It's amazing. Yeah. And then I guess continuing on with this community theme, Chris, in your episode, I was really struck at the way that you described the change in communities from these really small, tightly knit groups to larger ones that perhaps put a higher value on independence and leaving the nest, which makes it infinitely harder, I think, for young people to feel supported and safe, and even have a path forward after leaving their schooling experience. So my question to you is really, what steps did you take at Big Picture Ukiah to really center students and their humanity so that they were equipped after graduation to lead really productive and purposeful lives?
Yeah, that's a big question. I might need a few hours on this one, but well, first I want to, just before I complete, it's part of the answer to this, but Charlene, you brought up something that I think is kind of what we incorporated in a different way, but I think it was with the intentionality was the same. So we learned, we have in our in our community, we have about 20%, or my school, I have 20% Native American. There's 10 different tribes. We have 50%, 60%, depending on the year, Latino. And we're, our town was primarily white by, in the sense of the colonial, takeover of this area. We always spend our time talking about how much the land actually belongs to the Native community. But one of the things that the schools never did, and that we heard from the tribe, or I heard from the tribes, is that we need the schools to look like the kids. So, where Charlene was talking a bit about the reading, and I think that's really important. And when you get into the higher grades, what we are finding is that the kids didn't feel like they were connected to the school in any way. The teachers didn't look like them, right? The school itself, the plant itself did not look like them. So the art, artifacts, anything that would help represent the groups and so what we did is we brought in community members, the parents of some of the kids, grandparents. We reached out to local, community groups and brought them in and asked them, can you redo this entire campus in a way that looks like our kids? So we've started putting up murals. I got in a lot of trouble for that, but we just went for it. We started putting in, we would bring in community members into the campus that represented the groups, for Latino to the Native groups, and did, cultural fairs and things like that. And then once the kids feel like the place was theirs, now they can grow, right? Now they can vault into the things that we want them as educators to do, academically rigorous, trying to learn more, research, and so on. The other side of the community part, that going back to the original question, is I used it to leverage the school and the changes that we were doing to create a school system that would not disappear overnight if I were to walk away. My feeling is that you don't want to build a school or a program around one person. And because if they leave, then the whole thing falls apart. So, and typically, sometimes you don't necessarily have somebody to fill in your shoes when you leave. So luckily I had something like that. But my feeling was, if I could get the community to love the kids, to love the school, to give the kids a place to go outside of the four walls, then this program would survive. And so those were the ideas. And that all came from a concept of looking at ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, resiliency, that the only way a lot of these kids will ever get out of those traumatic, because I work with at-promise kids for, we at risk, at prom, we call them at-promise kids, where they come from a lot of trauma, that there are a lot of ways to kind of go at this and helping them heal from it all. But if you could find one person in their life to really care about them, then they have a better chance of kind of coming out of those traumatic experiences, right? The PTSD. We don't have enough people in the schools to do that, right? Very loving people, a lot of support, but not enough. And we were calling on the neighborhoods, the businesses, the organizations, the institutions to come in, or for us to send out our kids through internships and programs to make those connections, so that they found a loving relationship, so that person on the weekend, or they ran into him in downtown and say, hey, how are you doing, Johnny? What are you up to? So all those pieces were really crucial to build community into the school, as opposed for us just trying to do it all ourselves and on our own.
Wow, that's
Annie,
incredible.
Yeah, it is. Annie, can I jump in?
Right.
You and I talked about an organization that you work for. Speaking of elevating humanity, social justice issues, inclusion, oftentimes it's hard to be included when you don't have the instrument, when you don't have the very thing that could put you, for example, in a crescendo orchestra or in one of your other orchestras. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that work and how it creates inclusion through an actual thing that you get to have, that can help you make music.
Yeah, there's actually several avenues that this comes to be. And Chris, so much of what you were saying, and say for you, Charlene, like was just resonating like in my head. Like I just love everything that you both were saying. But for the instruments, so Fairfax County Public Schools has a program called Instruments for All, which is like one of the reasons that I wanted to work in this county. So any student that qualifies for free or reduced lunch gets a quality instrument for a one-time pay of $20. for the whole year. And it's not a junk instrument that you get off the internet. It's nothing like that. It's a quality instrument, because if you don't have the tools to properly develop even a good sound, like, you're never going to sound good. And like, how demotivating is that? Like, a student knows when they like are able to do something or when they're not. But beyond that, Josh and I had a great time discussing a group that I have called my Crescendo Orchestra, which is my orchestra for students with significant and severe disabilities. And I adore that class so much, but I needed instruments that could take a hit and that I could scribble all over and put stickers on and just kind of destroy in order to make it accessible for each student and for their needs. And so I got to partner with this organization called Instruments in the Attic, a nonprofit who gives instruments that have kind of been forgotten about in the back of people's closets, molding away, and they bring them in, and a music shop repairs them, and then they bring them here. And so I get to do whatever I need to make those instruments accessible for people. But that's one thing I love to tell educators and people, like, there are so many nonprofits and grants and avenues out there to get your students the tools and appropriate things that they need. And it's oftentimes the hardest thing of connecting ourselves to those, but they're out there to get our students what they need.
And Annie, can you, I know you and I talked about this almost, it was difficult for you because the Grammys really focused on this, on the crescendo, right? Almost to the point where there was almost nothing else happening. That's all the media really wanted to talk about. But I wonder if you can just share, like, as if we're standing outside and we have a window and we can look in, what is that moment like when these kids first get the instrument, and what happens in those moments? Why is that such a elevating humanity kind of moment?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, Josh, because it's actually the same moment for every student when they first make that first sound. And so with crescendo, I love speaking about one student in particular. His name is Kevin. His family is completely fine with me speaking about him. And he is actually the reason that Crescendo Orchestra began. And this was like during COVID, and our students with significant and severe disabilities were first brought back into the schools because virtual learning was not accessible to them. And so they came back in, and I was teaching from the classroom because my husband decided to renovate like the entire home during virtual teaching. So I was locked in my classroom away from everyone else, but I invited them down, and Kevin in particular was so angry that his entire routine had been thrown off. But I started playing the cello for him. And he goes, me, me, me. And so I let him take the cello, and he bowed back and forth on it. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world, but tears started welling up in his eyes because it was his first time engaging in like the creation of sound. And the cello is like completely his thing now. And he actually has come back since he's graduated as my instructional assistant to help teach that class, which is so fun. But it's the same moment of connection that we all have, because music is one of the most fundamentally human things that we all have in the world. This ability to connect for humanity, to understand. It's a very, very humanizing thing, no matter your background, and a way that we can all understand. And so no matter if it's a student in crescendo who's playing for the first time, or a parent who's making a sound for the first time and connecting with their student, playing Twinkle Twinkle with them, or just any of my kids playing for the first time, it's all the same.
That's so cool. And Mel, it really connects, and Nick and Chris, it really connects us back to the day one discussion with the keynote with Dr. Yang about emotion and the ways that we discount emotion in education. And that really, Annie, what you're doing is you're elevating it to as much as you possibly can, because that's part of the process of making music, you know, in that metaphorical sense, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'll let Charlene, I'll come to you because this was something that I had a question I had before. As you were talking about your work, and I think you and I talked about this in the episode, all of your work seems to fall under a sort of social justice umbrella. It's all driven by that impulse. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about where that came from, how that became part of your kind of DNA of the work that you do?
I, I look back and I'm thinking about my parents. My parents are both, just helpers. My mother's a nurse, my dad's a sociologist. So I think from really young, there was always this conversation, always talking about how we could help somebody. We always had people living with us, people transitioning into the States. So I think a lot of that came from me recognizing that when we came to this country, I was born here, that we needed some support and somebody provided that for us. So how could we pay that forward? So that's kind of how it's always been for me. It's always been about how can I help somebody else? And no matter how far I go, there's always been somebody who's been helping me. I still have mentors to this day who continue to help me. So for me, it's like I can't keep things to myself. So how can I just make something better for someone else? And I'm just so passionate about language and language development. I think from my background in speech and language, and just recognizing there's such a human need for us to communicate through language. And there's been so many times where children, particularly those who are deaf and hard of hearing, have been told by clinicians, by educators, if they're speaking another language in the home, not to use that language. And that disconnects them from their community and disconnects them from their culture. So I think just having that mindset for me has always been like, how can I continue to help people? And then how can I make sure they feel connected? So I'm always thinking about just a sense of belonging. I think from my background as well, that's something that I just want people, I never want people to feel left out or not heard, or people to feel like they don't belong or they can't get what they need or succeed in some way. And I know I'm just one small person in this universe, but that's kind of, I think, where it may have come from, is probably from my parents and them just kind of instilling that like we got to help somebody in whatever we do.
Can I speak to that too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. I remember you talking about that in the podcast, and it was really, really powerful because I had never really thought about it in those real tangible terms about the belonging, right? So many of us want to belong to something, right? And it's so powerful when they finally connect. The side of social justice, we went to with social justice as kind of our, yes, we talked about interest-based learning, all this stuff too, but the social justice aspect of our school is very prevalent. But what we learned is that we have to teach social justice. We kept thinking all these
Yes.
kids are going to come in with all these things that have gone wrong in their lives, and they were going to have this voice and they were going to get out and do something about it. No, we realized with these 15, 16, 17-year-olds that they've been told or not told that they can actually do something about their situation,
Yeah.
that they don't know how to advocate for themselves. So we would have to teach them. And it was like pulling teeth with so many of our kids. And then we finally got them out, some of them, and start doing something and modeling it for it and creating a school that created this belonging, that we're all doing something about the
Yeah.
problems around social justice in our community. And some of them came along, but it was an interesting experience to learn that. So I just wanted
Yeah.
to chime in there.
And I see that too. Like our school starts at 18 months. So we have kids from 18 months through, and even staff, like there's a staff daycare there. So our kids are coming from 6 to 12 weeks or so. So we are starting kind of that social justice curriculum from very, very young. And I'm myself and Christiane, who you heard on the podcast, are kind of the two who are kind of getting that into the classrooms as early as 18 months, because kids can do it from very, very young. And I think it's a matter of us teaching them in their own way. Like young kids are so like fairness, right? That's how we get them. They know about fairness, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not fair. You took my toy. And I think just starting from there, that really helps the kids. So as they're getting older, they begin to realize, okay, it goes from like fairness to like fairness with me and then fairness to other people. And then how am I standing up for other people? So I think getting in there really young has been really powerful, that we've been able to see that in our program. And it's been really beneficial because our community comes from a more affluent kind of background, and really shifting the narrative around what social justice has been. It's been challenging, but I think we're making little steps day by
Yeah,
day.
honoring their voice at a young age and letting them know that when they say something, they're going to be listened to and they can do something about it. So many of our kids in public education, by the time they're 15 years old, 16, they've been told, sit down,
Yep.
do your work, don't speak out of line, right? Or it's around this project that's got some guardrails or guardrails on it. I think starting as young as possible. I mean, that creates a dangerous society, though. We're all worried about that. No, I'm kidding. But you know what I mean? I mean, there is a need for this in a very
Yeah.
real way.
Yeah.
With all this is like that you're always saying, it's amazing. I just did a keynote last night for an organization called Do the Right, like WRITE thing. And if educators, if you don't know about that, look it up. It's something that you actually implement in your schools. And it's all about student voice and teaching the students an avenue of them being change makers. And I was speaking with the former director last night, and she was saying how she's noticed a shift the last few years of students thinking that they can, from not knowing how to make change to students internalizing being, I am the change, like I can make the change. And that all comes from educators teaching that like concept of those things. So that's amazing. And Charlene, I wanted to say, I was listening to your podcast. It was also like super topical because I'm working with a band director right now who's deaf, and working with him and talking about how even if you're deaf or hard of hearing, how like music is still fundamentally connecting. And so something I do with my students when you're talking about like cultures and all of these things of feeling connected to them is we really emphasize playing music that is representative of their background. And I'm talking like their whole heritage. So like, yes, I brought in like a hip hop artist to like do beatboxing with the kids and collaborating over classical music, but then we're also playing music from El Salvador, or playing music from Ghana or things like that, and having the students research their own background to feel those sense of connection and family. Because even if they don't have the words for it, which a lot of my students expressed to me, like, I'm afraid I have the wrong words, like that I'm going to do my heritage wrong because I don't fully understand, or I don't feel Vietnamese enough or something. I said, but you do know the music. And that's like the perfect avenue to first ask your parents about it, and that door to be opening. So it's just interesting connections that I was hearing there as y'all were talking.
Yeah, love that.
Chris,
And my
this feels
husband's a musician too, Annie. So I really connected with your podcast. So he's a choral conductor, plays the organ, all these things. So I was like, oh yeah, Anwar would love this. He would love this.
Chris, this feels like a good moment to share the story either of Miranda or Mercy. I love the Mercy story because it's the mural, and it goes back to what you talked about earlier about creating a community of inclusion, or and that you see yourself. Where do you see yourself? And Charlene was talking about that as well. I wonder if you could briefly tell the story of Mercy, either one. Mercy
Sure, I'll
or
talk about Mercy because I think I talked a little bit about the Miranda, but Mercy came to us as a 15-year-old. I mean, she knows I say these things about her, but came to us with a lot of trauma, like most of our students. Would be in and out of school. Wouldn't see her for weeks. She would come in, so on and so forth. But she had, I don't know where it came from. I mean, it had to do with family. This real strong sense of community within the Native American community, and she had a very close friend who disappeared. And if some of you know about what's happening in some of the reservations, there's a large problem with missing. I'm gonna mess this all up, but it's basically the missing women of indigenous nations are just disappearing. And so she took that on and held on to it and brought in people from her community to start building murals, both on our campus and around town. This is highly controversial, which I had never thought it would be, but they did make a few, but we asked them to come onto our campus and create this giant mural. It turned out to be the first Native American done mural in our county, and we have a huge population in our county. So anyhow, she took this on. She brought in other people. She did work with other people. She ended up being kind of consulting as a teenager with other groups to help with this process. And then, for a long story short, she graduates, and basically I hire her 2 weeks later as a paraprofessional in our school, which was bittersweet. She was an amazing student or amazing worker, but she was also a little too close with the students, and she knew it and kind of realized that she probably needed to take a little bit of a break. But this is one of these women who I think would have just disappeared for not in any any reason other than her own emotions were coming through too large, where she was just going to fall into this kind of general this using alcohol and drugs, which she had problems with, her family did. We thought that she was going to go down that path, and it seemed to bring her out because we were honoring her and giving her purpose, where she was giving herself purpose. We were just giving her the canvas to do so in front of us. So short story, but yeah.
And Mel, you were gonna ask Charlene.
Yes. So we've been talking about different forms of art, right? Music, these murals. And I understand, Charlene, that you have another form of art. You're an image consultant, and you help women communicate their authentic and unique styles. So how do you see that as pushing forward your work in whatever aspect?
I was wondering if you guys were going to go to that question today. I was like, maybe we could just stay in the education realm. But I think that, I growing up, I wanted to be like a hairstylist. So my dad was like, let's choose another avenue. So this is where I landed, but just recognizing that, you communicate something about yourself by the way you appear, by how you dress. And I think there was a couple started with friends, mostly just saying like, hey, like we don't know how to dress, we have this event, can you help us, put things together? And then more so people recognizing like, I'm not feeling great about myself, like what can I do so that I can feel better? So that's kind of how that work of image consulting started. I mean, it really started from very young on. I was the person that people would take to shop with them, help me pick out something that represents me. So I think for me, it's just communication is in so much. And like, how can somebody feel better about themselves by the way they communicate their style? And it's just helping people find that authentic piece of themselves, which I know, like, as busy professionals, we lose sight of that. And I'm seeing it now transferring to my students. I have a student who started through my summer program who has now come into the River School and is graduating and is going to one of the more competitive schools in DC. And her style has evolved. And we were talking about it this week. And I was telling her, I was like, you're starting to dress like me. She's like, maybe a little bit. So it's just seeing people like build that self-confidence, I think, is kind of where the art plus my communication background kind of comes together, because I love style, I love fashion, I love, all that kind of stuff, because it communicates a part of me and my heritage, I think. So just helping other people communicate what that means to them is something that I enjoy.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Charlene, with us. And I think
Annie,
sorry,
yeah,
go ahead, Josh.
let me jump in one more for Annie before we open it up kind of to questions and discussion. Annie, one of my favorite parts of both the prep and the episode um, was that moment when you brought the crescendo orchestra and the regular orchestra together, and there was this moment where they performed, in front of an audience, in an auditorium. And to me, as I was thinking about today, it was like such a beautiful example of something kind of technical. You get two orchestras together, they play a song, and then, something like that happens. But such a beautiful example of sort of a community elevation of the humanity of everybody in the room. A lot of emotion in that. And I wonder if you can describe what happened there for everybody here, and what that was like.
Well, even better, Josh. So after we spoke, I had worked on a project all year that came to fruition of we commissioned a work. So a piece was written for our orchestra where it was a part piece where there was five different parts. So all different ability levels. So no matter where a student is in their learning, they had a part that they could play, including adaptive parts. And it was incredible. It was incredible for a multitude of reasons.
Uh-oh. Annie, we lost your audio. Annie?
Oh, maybe she
to the
can.
students, but it's up to them to listen and to follow those. Oh no, my internet, why is it saying it's unstable? Can you
We
hear me
lost
now?
about a minute there, Annie. Yeah, go
Oh
back. Yeah.
no. So we have this commissioned work. Did you hear that part?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So at the end of the year, when you have like this piece that you're putting on, it's no longer in your hands. It's in the student's hands. And
Yeah.
I can just express things with my hands and show it to them, but it's up to them to breathe together, to watch each other, to move together, to be one. And to have 5 different parts doing that at the same time, it is so connecting. Like it is all relying and trust on each other that you're all going to interpret it together and in that same moment. And it's beautiful. But even beyond that, for another talk I'm writing right now, but the other day at the end of the school year, I was staying way back after school and I heard some laughter from the instrument closet or the instrument locker room. And it was weird because like the late bus had already run, like all the kids should have been gone. And so I went in there and I found my student Mark and a student named Billy, who is not in my crescendo orchestra, but he is a student with significant and severe disabilities. And unbeknownst to me, Mark has been teaching Billy cello for like the last 2 months. And I didn't know he was doing this. His private lesson teacher didn't know that he was doing this. And then beyond that, Mark would take Billy to Billy's after school grocery job. He would drop Billy off at school. They would go have like dinner together, ice cream together. And I pulled him aside after. I was like, Mark, why didn't you tell me about this? And he was like, well, it doesn't matter. Like, Billy's just my friend. And the fact that he didn't think it was something to tell me about was the most beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Because Billy is just Mark's friend. And
Yeah.
that's it. And it's all because of this connection of music. So
Oh, wow. Wow, that's amazing. I love, Annie, the idea that, that the piece was commissioned so that multiple levels could come in. That's something very different, than I experienced during my prep. Like that's a level of, inclusion that's very cool. So that's awesome. Yeah.
thanks.
So I think we have just a little under 15 minutes left. So I think at this point we would love to open it up. Anybody who wants to come off mic, make a comment, provide an insight. I'm not sure, Nick and Chris, if anything came up in the chat.
I would say, I mean, a lot of positive reinforcement for the things being said here. I want to come back perhaps to Chris's comments about the murals, because I think it was a little bit of a side note to say like how tough it was to get these things, but then a lot of feedback in the chat about how vital that is to community. And
Yeah.
I don't know, for people who are trying to move in those directions and create space and co-create space with students, for those of you who have had to overcome those hurdles, do you have ideas for people who are commenting in the chat on the vitality of that, but also the hard sell it might be to people hesitant to change their space and give up control?
I'm laughing right now because you're going to hate my answer. My answer is just do it. Just get in trouble and just do it.
I love that answer.
I mean, that's what I did with the program. That's what I did with the murals. I do that all the time. And the reality is I'm not worried about losing my job, right? And that's something that is just a part of my mentality. And I know that's not necessarily where everybody lives. Like they're worried about what happens if they get fired and where their next paycheck's going to come from. I don't live that way. I try to take risks. And, I've been homeless literally. And so I think out in DC, probably right in Charlene, you probably know where I was, but from where I was. But I just don't think when you go to anybody in administration at the top tiers, their immediate answer is always going to be no. They're thinking about every liability problem, everything under the sun. So it's going to be no. So my thing is just do it and ask for forgiveness later. And if they're going to have to undo it, then fine. They're going to have to fight, not just with me, but the entire community, both the school and the outside community, about what they're doing by rolling all that back. Yeah, it's gotten me in a lot of hot water, but I think you can do it. I think building the relationships with the community first is probably the only thing I would say for advice. I genuinely telling you, I don't think it's good to go and ask for permission. It takes years to get things approved, if ever at all. Just do it. Sorry, simple.
You know, Nick, I can just add really quick here that I did an episode with someone. Her first name is Lipoa, and she's the executive director of a program called Makahana Kaike, which means in doing one learns. And it's based in Hana on Maui. And this program is all about, Chris, you know, it's about those kids, right? That we talk about, those kids, the at risk, the ones who are not succeeding in traditional education settings, and putting them into a program where everything that they're doing is doing. They're just doing, they're building, they're designing, they're building accessibility ramps for elders in the community and so on. And one of the things that they did was that they built a classroom on the campus of Hana High and Elementary School, but they never informed DOE administration about it. It's this gorgeous Hawaiian native wood classroom. And when the complex area superintendent came for a visit, he was like, what the hell? There's a classroom on campus. You had no permission, you have no permits, you had nothing, but it's still there. So Chris, that's awesome. Yeah.
Anybody else here? Again, I don't know why the murals are a sticking point. I think people, it's a real touchstone for folks who are trying to make these changes and kind of run into things. Monique even says, I run the mural crew group at the high school. That's very cool to kind of turn it into a structured activity.
So they're
Yeah.
actually a self-driven student group. They organize. I'm just like the person that gets in trouble whenever they get in trouble. And I'm like, no, you won't touch my kids. But we started honestly like we wanted to be able to move from inside the classroom because we went through the contract and we went through all of like the legal documents and stuff like that. And one of the legalese was that what teachers did inside that space was totally up to them. Like there were obviously like some stuff when it came to like fire hazards and things like that that were not okay. But if they were providing the funding and stuff like that, then it was fine. But then to take it out into the community, we started with like May You Be You, which is the mental health awareness month that we do at our school. And we just asked like, okay, so who wants their door painted? What do you want people to see as they come through your door and when they meet you at your door? And then all the counselors were like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then slowly but surely, everyone felt like if they didn't do something, they were the ones that were not accepting of students. So peer pressure worked on our favor in that one.
Wow. Interesting.
Monique actually brings up this really important point about the role of school leaders and how part of that is really making the space for innovation to happen, up to and including taking the heat, I think, for what happens afterwards, so that that kind of culture can really grow in the schools and the communities.
Yeah, I used to say that a lot to my staff. I said, look, you guys do what you're going to do inside of these walls. My job is to protect you from the outside community and the administrators from getting in, right? That was all I would do and say. And it created a real safe space. It created some real interesting problems, but it was at the same time, it was fun to watch us work through them. But yeah, I highly recommend and I believe in what you're saying.
Yeah, it's interesting because my admin, when I first got to the school, he had cut the orchestra program position from a full-time position to a part-time. And so he was not a supportive administrator of like the arts and stuff. And recently he and I did like a co-presentation together, and he dropped this slide on me in front of everybody that I had no idea he was going to say, which was, some of the best teachers that are in the classrooms are your performing arts teachers. And so it went from him thinking that my job is not even worth being staffed full time to this. And I asked him about it later, and he said, well, you showed me why rather than tell me why. And but because of that trust now, like, he's given me so much space and like freedom to create and do things. And it's something that's beautiful when administrators support their teachers rather than what seems like to block every avenue. So I'm very grateful to a man who humbled himself enough to learn and to change and grow. And he's one of the most supportive teacher or administrators that I've ever worked for.
Any other, we're down to our last 3 minutes here. Any other comments? Anybody want to come off mic and share their thoughts? Just wanted to check in here. Okay.
Well, I think, Josh, I know you dropped some links earlier in the chat, but I will do so again to make sure everyone has those. So it's links to the What School Could Be community, but also to each one of our guest episodes so that people can learn a little bit more about them and all the goodness that they bring to this conversation. So I'll get those put into the chat right now.
And I'll just share here at the end, Nick and Chris, again, thank you for this opportunity. I think I've shared with you before that a couple of years ago, I began a very intentional process of engaging podcast guests in things after their episode had aired. And Charlene and Annie and Chris, you're part of a growing podcast family of people who have done that, who have come into workshops or come into situations and extended the conversation that began in the episode itself. So Chris and Nick, really appreciate the opportunity to do this today. The What School Could Be podcast, super stoked. We just passed 100,000 downloads in over 125 countries. We are elevating the stories of educators and education leaders from all around the world. And so it's a very joyful process for me to produce it and to host it because I get to learn so much about people. So my learning curve, just really goes up. So your conference to restore humanity has provided us with a great platform to put the whole thing up in front of people. I'm very grateful for that.
Awesome. And thank you all so much. Honestly, somebody in the Discord earlier today just asked, is there a list, a network of all these schools that we can go find? And honestly, thinking about it now, probably the best thing that you can do is go to the What School Could Be podcast list and connect with people and contexts like Charlene, Chris, Annie, all the other people that they've had on here, and just kind of go through and find them piecemeal and honestly, go to the partner page on the What Schools Could Be website because the sad part is there's not like a roster of a list of affiliates and schools that's, this huge network because we are kind of working in our own little silos sometimes. So part of this conference is to help bring the people, context, sites together to say, there's a lot of ways of doing school and doing education. And here we can get together and make a better experience for everybody. So again, huge thanks, Josh and Mel, for you and for our other guests on the panel here today. For conference attendees, we've got the Thought Sanctuary tonight with the Minor Collective. Cornelius and Cass, who had joined us for this morning's Q&A, are going to be hosting a space for conference attendees to share out. I don't know. This is a new thing. I don't know what they've got planned. So show up and plan on having a good time there too. But thanks again, y'all. And hopefully we'll see you this afternoon or this evening, I suppose.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Annie,
Awesome.
Charlene, Chris.
Take care.